Hi, this is Evan here from Latinum at latinum.org.uk, and in this video we're going to look at Bennett's The Sounds and Inflections of the Latin Language, chapter 2, where he talks about the sources of information. How do we know, where do we get the information from about how we go about pronouncing Latin, seeing that Latin is a dead language and we can't go and dig up a Roman and ask him how he spoke or she spoke. So, sources of information. Our sources of knowledge concerning the ancient pronunciation of Latin are the following. Statements of Roman writers. Much has been left by the Roman grammarians on the subject of pronunciation, far more, in fact, than is commonly supposed. The remains of the grammatical writers, as collected and edited by Kyle under the title of Grammatici Latini, at the time that Bennett was writing this, 1880, filled 8 large quarto volumes. There are now far more of these. These writers cover the entire field of grammar, and most of them devote more or less space to a systematic consideration of the sounds of the letters. As representative writers on this subject may be cited Terentianus Maurus, who lived in 185 AD, an author, and he wrote a book called De Litteris Syllabis Metris. Marius Victorinus, 350 AD. Martianus Capella, either the 4th or 5th century AD, not in Carl's collection at the time this was printed. Priscian, 500 AD, who wrote the famous Institutionum Grammaticarum. Even the classical writers have often contributed valuable bits of information, notably Varro in his De Lingua Latina, Cicero in his rhetorical works, Quintilian in his Institutio Oratoria, and Aulus Gellius in his Noctes Atticae. A second important source of evidence is found in inscriptions. The total body of these is very great. The Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum, in process of publication since 1863, at the time this was printed, consisted of 15 large folio volumes. It's now much larger than that. These inscriptions disclose many peculiarities of orthography, that is, the spelling, which are exceedingly instructive for the pronunciation, and thus we find spellings such as urps with a P and plebs with a P by the side of urbs with a B and plebs with a B. And this clearly indicates the assimilation of B to P before S. So Romans said urps and plebs and not urbs and plebs, and so on. Even the blunders of the stonecutters often give us valuable clues. In other words, spelling mistakes are extremely instructive because sometimes the stonecutters were not highly educated, so they wrote things down as they heard them. For example, spelling acletarum with a C for atletarum spelled with a TH, which shows that TH was not pronounced th, but was practically a T, t, an aspirated T, atletarum. Otherwise, we could not account for its confusion with the letter C. Greek transliterations of Latin words constitute a third source of knowledge. Not only Greek writers, especially the historians of Roman affairs, but also Greek inscriptions afford us abundant evidence of this kind. Thus, the Greek kikeraun, for Cicero, or Cicero in the English, furnishes support for the K sound of the Latin C, while we find forms such as leouia and ualentia, and these also witness the W sound for the Latin letter V. The inscriptions are naturally much more trustworthy guides in this matter than our texts of the Greek authors, for we can never be certain that the manuscripts, that's either the Latin manuscripts for that matter, or the Greek manuscripts, have not undergone alterations in the process of transmission to modern times. But of course we do now have access to all the material from Herculaneum, which wasn't available, much of it wasn't available at the time this was written. And of course, those texts have not been interfered with because they date from Roman times. But we don't have a lot of material from Herculaneum, but what we do have is helpful in this regard as well. The Romance languages also, within limits, may be utilized in determining the sounds of Latin. And this is something that modern students often take to extremes. They say, oh, Italian has this and Spanish has this, and therefore the Romans must have pronounced it that way. No, 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 no. The modern languages themselves have changed immensely in the way they're pronounced, even in living memory. For example, just take the example of English. If you look at and listen to videos of Her Majesty the Queen from 50 years ago, and you listen to her speaking now, her pronunciation has changed over the course of her life. Imagine over the course of 2,000 years. Bennett quotes some texts here in German, the Grundriss der romanischen Philologie and Grammatik der romanischen Sprachen, and there's plenty of other more modern material that deals with this. But what's important to note is that the contemporary pronunciation of Italian, of Spanish, of and other Romance languages or semi-Romance languages like Romanian are of very limited use. Then we have sound changes of Latin itself as analyzed by etymological investigation. That's the history of words. Modern scholars, particularly in the last 50 years, that's the last 150 years for us, have done much to promote the scientific study of Latin sounds and forms. And while much remains to be done, the ultimate solution of many problems has already been reached. And this is pretty much the case. There is almost unanimous academic consensus about how the educated Romans of the time of the late Republic pronounced their Latin. There's very little argument anymore among the scholars, although if you do put up a YouTube video in restored classical pronunciation, you will find that a lot of people will comment on this because they are used to medieval or semi-medieval pronunciations of Latin, where what happened was in every country in Europe, Latin was simply pronounced the same way that the language of that place was pronounced. And no attempt was made to try and pronounce Latin in the way that the Romans pronounced it. And so we have something that is now called Ecclesiastical Pronunciation, which is Latin pronounced as though more or less it were modern Italian. And in England there was a form of pronunciation which now has died out, where Latin was pronounced as though it were English. And in fact, in biology, when we pronounce Latin in biology, often the Old English pronunciation system is still used. So we say things like cactus for cactus, things like that. Bennett here cites a whole lot of works. I'm not going to go into them. Let's just turn the page and look through them. Stoltz, Lindsay, Giles, Sommer, etc. If you want to have a look at these, you can. Alexander Ellis's The Quantitative Pronunciation of Latin is available on Google Books or on archive.org. The most up-to-date book on the subject, the one that most people tend to refer to, is that by Allen, Vox Latina. And there's another book that people refer to as well by Sturtevant. And Sturtevant also wrote a Latin grammar and a monograph on the pronunciation of Latin. And that, I would say, has similar level of authority to the work by Allen. You can find Allen's work on Google Books, but not as a full download. You can just do a preview. If you want to buy it, then you need to go to Amazon or your local bookshop and order a copy. So that's a summary of the sources of the evidence for how we know Latin was pronounced in ancient times, given that we don't have a time machine. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you want to listen to me reading Latin in Restored Classical, please do visit latinum, latinum.org.uk, and you'll find all of the Latin courses and resources I produced in audio at Patreon.